Many of these themes fit this pattern of pieces that are already in place that will continue to be expanded and deepened. And the pattern, I mean, it's visible to me, and it might be visible to other people, but not many are talking about it, if any. And so um, I'm trying to draw attention to these things because I know they're not so visible to other people. It's like um, you can Google this, but the description has been given before of a stadium that has a drop of water in it, and that drop of water doubles in volume every second. And then the question is, how long would it take for the water to fill the stadium if the amount of water doubles every second? And it takes a shockingly short amount of time. It's kind of mind blowing to work through the example. And if you apply this to people, they don't really see the water until it's just a few doublings away from covering the whole stadium. And so most people, figuratively speaking, most people are up in the nosebleed seats. And so it would take an awful lot of water for them to see. And they're not paying attention. You can only see things that you're looking at. And so one example of this is um, the changes that you could put under the title of restriction of freedom of travel. Now, this has been in place for a very long time, this march towards restriction of travel. You could look at the implementation of TSA after 9/11 as a piece of this process. Uh, Many travel restrictions were implemented during COVID. And each time this limit is advanced, each new extreme provides a starting point for the next push in that direction. It becomes easier to traverse that again. And you have to pay attention to the underlying principles that are being violated. We tend to think in terms of rules and not principles. And so, those of us who are old enough to remember traveling by air prior to 9/11, it was a piece of cake to just walk on a plane. You had to go through a metal detector, that's it. And of course, now it's a very different situation. That scale of shift, you become accustomed to it, and then you only notice new levels of change. Um, but based on principle, it's not. Oh, and then there's the no-fly list, right? Which I don't know why, but for years I was on this list where I don't know what the list was, but every single time I went through security, they'd pull me aside. Um, and that stopped. I found out some hack where if you put in some number off of your military ID, and I was in the military at the time, um, that wouldn't happen anymore. It's weird, but anyway. So if they can prevent you, if you can be prevented from traveling for one thing, doesn't matter what the thing is, then you could be prevented from traveling for anything. Think about this with the Second Amendment. That's definitely the case there as well. And so, anyway, sticking to the point, freedom of travel. Um, you will see further restrictions in freedom of travel. Now, what are some of these that I can help you specifically uh, predict? So already there's an immense push towards electric vehicles. And Um, I don't know whether I want to get into it or not. Sorry, my mind is going towards this, pointing out the fact that people try the people like to suppose that a lot of these changes come because of or through a conspiracy. And there's a really interesting passage about this in Isaiah. Let me look that up while I'm talking to you here. And if you're locked into that pattern of thought, you're not going to catch an awful lot of what you could. One reason that people want to think that there's a conspiracy is that um, it's comforting. It's comforting to it's the same exact impulse that causes people to force complicated issues into binary issues of right and wrong, of good and bad, and the impulse to categorize people this way as well. And you'll see something of value in someone and then assume that they're a good person. It doesn't matter what the thing of value is. They could be good looking, they could have a good piece of advice, um, they could lend you money. I don't know. It could be anything. And you want that person to be good because it's a simplification. It makes your life simpler to have people be simple. And it's the same thing with issues. And of course, that causes tremendous problems because people and things are complicated. And that ought to be our default assumption, but it isn't. And when it comes to events and situations, we also apply this assumption that things are simple. And when things are way worse than it seems like they should be, or way worse than we thought they were, we want to shove that into a box that makes it simple again. Because what would it mean if things are unpredictable at that level? If something that we thought was fully known is unpredictable, it means everything's unpredictable. And no one wants that. I mean, that's a massive amount of energy that you have to put into life that you didn't have to put into life before. Now, you always had to, but you didn't know. You thought everything was simple. And it's like, have you ever taken a cat outside for the first time, a house cat? And what they do is they crouch down on the ground. They won't move. They flatten their body on the ground and they won't move. Because instinctively, they're bombarded by new information. And instinctively, they know that's dangerous. Because these are patterns they have not worked out. The cat might be 6 years old. So not a novice at life, but they'll be really uncomfortable and they'll just crouch down on the ground and not know what to do. And it's the same for a lot of animals, actually. I've seen this happen. So um, that's how people are too. When you put them into a completely new situation that shows them that they have no idea what's going on, and we want something. We want something to explain it. And not just explain it, but make it go away. And so conspiracy does that. But it's been said, um, don't attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. I think that's the quote, and I'm sorry I don't remember who said it. But it's absolutely true that it tends to be the case, probabilistically, that when things go wrong, it's a result of stupidity and not necessarily evil in the sense that of intentional malice. So what's amazing with these folks who who claim conspiracies for everything, like the reason I was about to talk about electric vehicles, the reason everything's marching towards electric vehicles is there's this grand conspiracy, and they know what they're doing. There is a they, not to quote Kanye here, but there is a they. Um, but it's not some group of people who all know each other and all have made this secret deal and somehow are absolutely brilliant architects of human behavior and thought. Um, and there are smaller groups of people who do plan things and who do bring them to pass, but that it's like at this level, there are these little groups. But to understand what's going on, you have to go up higher, and that's far beyond the pay grade of any person. So, at least so far, that's cryptic. I'm sorry, but as things march on, you will see larger and more powerful groups. But for now, it's not the case. So what's happening is it's behind the scenes, and it's a mix. You could explain this away spiritually, um, by pointing to Satan, because he is the architect of these things in a sense. And then there's another way of explaining it. I said explain away, that has a negative connotation, but explaining. There's another way of explaining it where you look at a confluence of factors, many of which are outside the hands of any person or group of people, but certainly all of which. So the confluence of these things, it's a complex system beyond the grasp of any human or set of humans. But it's like a river flowing or a ball falling through gravity. If you know the law of gravity, you can predict where that ball is going to go. Or you launch a ball out of a cannon. It's the same idea. So here's the verse from Isaiah. This is the Gileadi translation of Isaiah 8:12. Do not call a conspiracy all that these people call a conspiracy. Be not afraid or awed by the thing that they fear. So it's a very interesting verse. The King James renders it, say ye not a confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy. Neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid. So there are definitely people conspiring to push the green agenda onto folks who would not choose it. But it's part of a larger picture that you need to understand. Okay, so freedom of travel. So there's not some group of people who's sitting around a boardroom saying we need to constrain freedom of travel. It's just that that's going to be the end result, and it's the latent driver of these factors. It's predictable, like the arc of a cannon shooting a ball through the air. And if you know where it starts, you can calculate where it's going to end. And I'm giving you some keys to what I call generative prophecy here that I'll talk about specifically at some other time. So they again, they'll deploy a toolbox that is the same toolbox they use for pretty much everything. So you're going to see things like new taxes or taxes used in creative, shadowy ways to push electric vehicles. So what do I mean by that? One example might be road tax. And this is an example of something that's already in play, but you may or may not have noticed it. I'll talk about road tax and insurance. So the cost of electric vehicles is higher than gas vehicles and diesel vehicles. And so how can they how can they push, one way they can push this onto people is by increasing the cost of internal combustion engine vehicles. So if internal combustion engine vehicles cost as much as electric vehicles, so in a magic world, they could reduce the cost of electric vehicles down to the price of, sorry, if this is where internal combustion engine vehicles are, they could reduce the price down to be the same. And then there's one less challenge to adoption. You still have the inconvenience of charging. So they've tried to reduce the charging times, and they've succeeded to an extent. And Tesla, at least, has been pushing the price of electric cars way down. But all of these things are at the point of diminishing returns now. So electric vehicles are still much more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. So now the only option is to raise the price of internal combustion engine vehicles, and now there are fewer barriers of adoption to adoption. So how can they do this? Well, one is the fuel tax. So every state and the federal government applies this fuel tax, and electric car drivers don't pay it. So they're getting shadow subsidies from not having to pay fuel tax. And in a fair world, they would change this over to a per mile tax. And that has its own complications because they don't know how many miles you're driving, and they would have to implement technology to track that. And once they're tracking how many miles you're driving, they could use that for nefarious purposes, and they would, because that's human nature. But anyway, that would resolve the lack of fairness in the fact that electric car drivers don't pay fuel tax. They could increase fuel tax, and that would achieve that purpose as well. Another shadow way in which they're already making you pay for electric cars, even if you don't drive one, is through car insurance. Car insurance rates are skyrocketing because people are, well, it's a confluence of factors, and one of them is people are adopting electric vehicles. And one of the problems is that the chassis of these vehicles is where all the batteries are, and so the likelihood of an accident causing damage to that massive battery area is high, and they're not easily accessible, and they're very expensive to replace. But furthermore, if you have a Tesla, one of the ways they drastically reduce the cost is through the GigaPress. They're able to cast most of the car all at once instead of building separate components, and it ends up being massively less expensive. But the problem is when that one component is damaged, the whole thing has to be replaced. And that is basically the cost of getting a new car, oversimplifying things. So now if you get into a fender bender, the likelihood of your car being totaled versus an internal combustion engine is very high. So those things are part of a larger set of changes that are drastically increasing the cost of car insurance, and car insurance is required by law. And there are other things too that are driving that up. But you're going to see new things on top of this, new changes that increase the cost of internal combustion engine cars, and that will push more people into electric vehicles. There will be other changes as well. Obviously, fuel cost is one of them, and I'm pretty sure I've spoken about that a lot in the past. You can and should look at what fuel costs around the world, and you'll see where things are going. Because the United States has long enjoyed an unfair advantage in terms of fuel prices because of deals that we made after World War II in exchange with mostly the Saudi government. And as those things come to a close, we will not have any special advantage. And onto that, we continuously pile additional regulations to increase the cost of um, driving in whatever way. So one example of this is California um, has passed a law, and I can't remember when it comes to effect, I think in a year, that bans internal combustion engines on semi-trucks. And so something like 96% of vegetables in the United States are grown in California. And of course, California is home to many busy ports that import all the junk we buy from China and other places. And so all of those things are going to basically get a surtax because California has decided not to allow diesel trucks anymore. And you'll just keep seeing these things come across. And all of it, the end result of all of it in this lens is going to be that freedom of travel is curtailed. And that doesn't just mean international or interstate travel. You're going to see limits in your ability to drive to work, for example. Now, you might say, well, no big deal because your particular job, you can work from home. Well, that's your particular job right now and the conditions right now. Just as quickly as mass adoption of work from home happened, it could go the other way too. And you might say, well, I have Starlink and I live in a rural area, but I have Starlink and I can get online. Well, guess what? Putting all your eggs into the basket that one company provides is really not a good idea because that's a single point of failure. And if something happens and that goes up, or it just becomes very different than it is right now, you're in big trouble. Let's say you commute and you say, well, I'm pretty smart and I bought a fuel efficient vehicle, which, that's its own conversation. There are cars out there that get 50 miles per gallon. And you might say, well, yeah, they cost an extra $4,000 over the one I've got. How long does it take to recoup the cost of that when gas prices are $5 a gallon? So there are certainly ways to mitigate all of this, but suppose you did that. Okay, great. But what about when prices are $10 a gallon? And now your hour or hour and a half commute or 45-minute commute or whatever it is, now all of a sudden it's cutting into your food budget. And so it turns out that as these snares constrict, it will increasingly be the case that those who are able to best mitigate these things are those who've gone through what others considered extreme changes before they had to, before anyone else saw it coming, so that in the confluence of these things, they still have resources. So that might sound like a charge to prep. And I just want to be clear, there's really only so much you can do justly. And these people who go out and spend enormous sums of money on that, it's really important that you direct this to the right motive, which isn't, it's not to make your life, to make it possible to continue a life of luxury that you don't deserve. It's to ultimately to buy your time to help other people. That's really the ultimate goal, to provide a space for people to adjust to the true demands of reality. So basically, he who builds a house without the Lord builds it in vain. And anything that you try to construct in your life that's designed around minimizing suffering is really going to backfire or fail miserably. The trick is to orient yourself towards the maximization of meaning for you and others. So anyway, in general though, as you reduce your dependency on things remaining the same, and as you construct mechanisms to make yourself robust to the maximum amounts of change, so by not relying on one component, like, oh, I can, as long as I can commute an hour a day, I'm good. Well, what if you can't? You know, what if you can't get parts for your car? What if you can't get an oil change? You know, in my town we have like 20 mechanics or something, and somehow you can't get an appointment to go see one. And when you do, you have to wait for 3 hours, even when you have an appointment. I suppose they can't get enough trained technicians. I don't know what the problem is there. But if you've got it set up so you can do that yourself, then great. You only have to go to the mechanic when there's something serious that's gone wrong. So anyway, you're going to see this. Now ultimately, and this is a different video, but ultimately changes are going to come where travel itself will cease to happen. It's just not going to happen. But in all of these things, you have to see the near term, what comes after that, and then the long term, near, medium, and long term. And the long term is that that's it. You're going to be wherever you are and wherever you can walk to, usually under the threat of your life. That's where it's going to go. But in the nearer term, and that's the point of this series of videos, the 2023 warnings, is that the changes in the short term, I think, are bigger than what people anticipate. Even though they're right in front of you, I mean, it's pretty dang obvious, but people don't see it. So